I'm not sure that is on full screen, but hopefully. So the Irish hare, where do we start? So the Irish hare in Irish is called Gria, and the origin is thought to be Gear Fia, which is from Gar for short and Fi or Fia for deer. So a short deer is what it was called before. And the Irish hare, or hares in general, belong to a group of mammals called lagomorph. So they include the Leopardea, which are the hares and the rabbits, and the Oncodontia, which are picas. So if you're looking at the screen on the left-hand side, there's a small, almost bunny-like creature with small little ears. These are picas, and you find them in sort of cold areas. They're small, like the steppes, and they're small little mammals, very cute. Then in the middle we have a hare, not an Irish hare. You'll note the ears are particularly big. So these are hares that we might find in desert areas or very warm areas, and those ears help to keep it cool. And then on the right, far right, as you're looking at the screen, are rabbits. So these are the different. These can all be grouped together and called lagomorphs. And the in Ireland, we just have hares and rabbits, no picas, and the Irish hare is native, and we suspect that the rabbits were probably brought in by the Normans. So they were brought to Britain by the Normans, and they were probably brought and kept in man-made warrens and used as a food source. And then gradually they escaped and naturalized into the environment. We do have records of brown hares being introduced into Southern Ireland in the late 1800s, but there's no, the last two surveys which were carried out in Ireland found no evidence of brown hares in Ireland, at least in the southern part of Ireland, but in Northern Ireland there is confirmed brown hare populations, especially around Lough Neagh. So there have been reports of them in Donegal, and occasionally people see them, but we're hoping that we don't have them in other parts of Ireland. And they were introduced usually for hunting or for coursing, so they will interbreed with our native hares, and what we think are possible hybrids have been seen in Northern Ireland. And you can tell the Irish hare from the brown hare ears. So if you imagine bending the ears of the hare over its head, the Irish hare's ears would only come as far as its nose, while the ears of the brown hare are much longer, so they'd come beyond the tip of the nose. And the Irish hare, which is the picture on the right-hand side, I should have said that, while the brown hare's picture on the left-hand side, the Irish hare has a much more delicate features, so they don't look as awkward as a brown hare would. A brown hare, sort of when it's loping around, it sort of almost looks awkward, but an Irish hare seems to be much more graceful in the way it moves about. And we'll talk a little bit about other ways that the Irish hare is unique as well. So when over the years, a number of genetic studies have been done on European mountain hare populations. So the Irish hare in Latin is called Lepus timidus hibernicus, so hibernicus referring to Ireland. And it's a subspecies of the mountain hare, Lepus timidus. And the mountain hare is found right across Northern Europe. So you find it in Scotland, Sweden, Finland, all those different countries will all have mountain hare populations. And the genetic studies suggest that the Irish hare is actually more closely linked to those European mountain hare populations rather than the Scottish cousins, the ones that you'll find in Scotland. And they think that the Irish hare colonized Ireland during the last ice age. And there are cave fossils which support the presence of hares 28,000 years before present. And then again, when they've looked at molecular genetic analysis, it suggests that the ancestors split from other mountain hares over 360,000 years ago, so a long time. And some people argue that the Irish hare should actually be its own species, so not just a subspecies of the mountain hare, but that it should be called Lepus hibernicus. But I think not enough genetic work has been done yet to say that. And the other Irish hare unique. So the picture at the top of the screen is a picture of the Irish hare, and the picture below that is a hare going white, and that's a mountain hare from Scotland. So the coat of the Irish hare can be quite variable in colour, but it's generally russet brown colour. But you will find darker individuals and lighter individuals. On Rathlin, I don't know if any of you managed to see the Wild Isles programme that was on over the last 3 weeks on a Sunday evening, but they had some recorded images of hares from Rathlin Island, and they're a very distinct golden colour. But I have seen light coloured hares also on the west coast of Ireland, and I'm sure other people have seen, sometimes they really are russet brown, sometimes they're much darker, and sometimes you get these light individuals. So the colour variation, it can be quite variable in an Irish hare. But the mountain hares that you find in Scotland and Northern Europe, they will molt to white in the winter. So like the Scottish mountain hare that is in the image at the bottom of that screen. So the Irish hare, occasionally, very occasionally, white ones will be recorded. But sometimes you will find hares that maybe are piebald appearance. So if you get a particularly cold winter, they might molt and they may have big blotches of white on them. But generally, they remain brown. But sometimes in the winter, you'll find that the fringes of the ears become more white. And their underbelly is white anyway, as are their feet. But sometimes the white fur on their feet starts to creep up their legs when they do their winter molt. So that's another reason, or another difference between the Irish hare and other mountain hares throughout Europe. Irish hare is the largest of all mountain hares. Generally, with hare species, the females are slightly heavier than the males. So the female Irish hare can weigh up to 4.5 kilograms. Compared to other mountain hares in other countries, they have a comparatively small home range. So a home range would be where an animal will spend most of its time. So the hares will move around a number of different fields over the course of a day or a night while it's feeding. And for the Irish hares, it's usually less than 50 hectares. But for other species of mountain hare, it can be 3, 4, 5 times that. But it may be that where the Irish hare are feeding, it's quite, the availability of food is good, so there's plenty of variety. There's enough for them to feed, so they don't need to range over big distances in order to find the food that they need. When you look at the skull and the jaw morphology of an Irish hare, it is also different to other mountain hares as well. So all these factors combine to suggest that it may well be its own unique species. Just to note this picture here as well, this is a female, and you can see she's looking quite large, so more than likely a pregnant female, but you can really notice, the white underbelly of her as well from this image. So this thing, usually mountain hares, as their name suggests, are found in more upland habitats. And if you think of somewhere like Britain, where again the mountain hare would have once been widespread throughout the whole of the country, now it is only found in the Scottish uplands, but also in the Peak District, population remains there as well. Um, so what happened when the brown hares were brought in is like they gradually outcompeted the mountain hares on those lowland habitats. Um, but the upland habitats didn't have enough suitable forage for the brown hares, and they never got to colonize those upland areas. But because we don't have brown hares in Ireland, or generally we don't have, particularly if we're talking about the Republic of Ireland, then all the habitats are available for hares to use. So Irish hares are widespread throughout lots of different kinds of habitats. So a lot of the place we will find them in are farming habitats. Some of you may see them in and around your own areas. So um, fields, and as long as there is somewhere where they will find shelter, and as long as there's food availability, those habitats are open to them. But you'll also find them on sort of peaty habitats as well, habitats such as bogs, upland bogs, but also lowland bogs as well. And again, then some kind of shelter, maybe just nice vegetation like heather or shrubby vegetation, or even rocks that they can hide behind where they'll find enough shelter. And quite often when you speak to farmers, they will talk, if they are in those sort of upland peaty areas, they will talk about the hares coming down to the lower fields to graze once spring comes. So farmers, a lot of farmers have suggested to me, particularly when I was doing my survey work, that the hares will go up into the hills in the winter, and then when the spring arrives, as soon as the green fields with their ryegrass, I mean the improved fields, start greening up, they'll come down onto those lower fields. And that might be just, to get a nice big flush of new grass, might be quite appetizing for them. And then you get them right up on top of mountains as well. So, seeing evidence of hares up on top of Neefin, as well as other mountains. And they literally go from mountains right down to the seashore as well. So when I was doing my research in Northern Ireland, one of our sites was farmland that backed onto Strangford Lough, and quite often you'd find them during the day down in amongst the rocks and seaweed along the coast. And I've seen the same on the Mulla Peninsula as well, where they sometimes will spend the day lying up in between rocks, right down in the shore. So it's another unique feature of the Irish hares that they are literally found from mountain top right down to the seashore. In terms of what so their diet will vary depending on what season it is and the type of habitat that they're living in. Quite a bit of work has been done on their diet, and they've been found that they'll eat grasses, sedges, heather, particularly ling heather, also called kaluna, is an important food source in those upland areas and those peat areas, particularly where it's available. And then but it may also be important, those, particularly in the spring, those grass areas may be important because they might be particularly high in nutrients as you get that spring flush coming. So the important things for hares, no more than ourselves, is to have a varied diet. So when you look at hair pellets, mash them up and put them in alcohol and look them under a microscope, you can look at the individual cells of plants, and every plant has got a different cell pattern. So you can tell what a hare has been eating. And every hair pellet you looked at, they would be eating a whole variety of different plants. So like ourselves, they need to eat a variety of foods in order to get all the minerals and vitamins and nutrients that they need to be fit and healthy. So it is really important that you don't have monocultures of ryegrass. You need lots of different grasses, sedges, flowering plants. They'll even take mosses. And in the winter months, when you get hard frosts or you get a covering of snow and they can't get at the grass, then they will also browse on trees, things like birch and willow. And some of you may have planted some new trees, and they particularly seem to like, they will go along a line of planted new oak and literally just bite off every one. So they can be a little bit of a problem if you are trying to grow a native forest, and if you have hares in the area, they can be an issue. The trees may need guards or fencing off. They will also strip bark off of young trees as well. But it's only when the conditions are bad. As I was saying, if there was frost, hard frost, or snow cover where they can't get at their usual food sources. So unlike rabbits, they don't have a den. So in order to find enough shelter and cover, they create what's called a form. And in this picture, it's not really a form that you see. The form usually is just an individual hare, and it's almost like a nest in the ground. So they'll tuck themselves deep into areas of tussocky grass or even rushes. They might find a secluded little spot at the bottom of a hedgerow. If they're up on an upland area, they might find an area where the peat, they can sort of make a little nest in the peat or in amongst heather. So anywhere they can get down, right down into the vegetation. And quite often you can be walking along and suddenly a hare jumps up in front of you because you just didn't see it, because it camouflages itself so well. And because it doesn't use these underground dens, these forms, because they manage to make them so sheltered, they reduce any exposure to wind, so it helps keep them warm. And if it's an open habitat, so up on a peatland, or in a big grassy field, they'll usually situate the form in a place that gives them a good view of the surrounding habitat. So they'll know if something's coming, and they rely very heavily on scent as well. So if you're downwind of a hare, you're more likely to get closer to it than if you're upwind of a hare. And they don't tend to see terribly well. What they do see is they see movement, but they don't necessarily see a person coming towards them or whatever it might be. But they'll note a movement, and that alerts them then to something coming and needing to be alert. So because there are no days are born above ground, and the young can be born at any time of year. There's been records of young right from January to December, but the peak breeding season is usually spring and early summer. And the females will produce 2 or 3 litters during the year. The first litters are usually smaller, and the later litters are often the larger 2 to 3 kits, or 4 even. And the young hares are left together in tall vegetation, and they the females will only come back to them to feed them once a day, usually at dusk or just after dusk. And the idea behind this is not to draw attention of predators to the hares. So the young hares are called leverets. So the litter might stay together for 1 or 2 days, and then they'll each find their own little space to hide down in amongst the grass or the heather, wherever it is that they've been born. And the females then just coming once a day to feed them and to groom them, and then she'll go off again, and won't come back to them the following day. So sometimes people can come across hares that they think have been abandoned, and they feel the need to rescue them, not understanding that the females are leaving them on purpose. She's leaving them because she's hoping not to draw attention to foxes, or grey crows, or whatever it might be that might predate on the hares. So this is a picture of two young hares that were rescued many years ago, and it's very hard to keep a hare in captivity. They don't generally thrive, but thankfully these two did, and they had a particular like for dandelion leaves. It wasn't me that rescued them; it was someone else who looked after them. But they love dandelions and dandelion leaves. And there's a lovely book, if you're interested. It's called, I'm trying to think of the name of it now. I think it's The Leap of the Hare, and it's about the zookeeper from Dublin Zoo many years ago, and he had a rescued hare who lived in his house. And it's just a lovely, if you come across it in an old bookshop, it's just a lovely story about this hare and how it lived in the house with them. But generally, hares don't take to captivity. They much prefer to be out in the wild and running wild and free. Um, the most distinctive well-known aspect of hare behavior is boxing, and that's where you see two hares that appear to be boxing each other. So they'll stand on their hind legs and they will use their front feet to hit each other. And it was thought originally that it was males who were boxing each other, but over time it has been discovered that it's actually the females warding off the smaller males. So the females don't want, during mating, the females are trying to ascertain who's the best mate to have, and she may not want a certain male, so she'll box him away, telling him she doesn't want his advances. And the sometimes as well, and these two pictures are pictures that you'll see them sort of running around a field chasing each other. And again, it's quite often a male and a female, and they're chasing around. It may be a way for the female to try and determine whether the male is a suitable fit candidate for her to mate with. Hares, again, this is a picture of a brown hare, and if you're interested, there is I wanted to talk about grooming, because hares spend an awful lot of time grooming. It's really important that their feet and ears are in good condition, so if they need to run from a predator, or they need to hear what's coming, so they'll spend a long time grooming. And this is a picture of a brown hare. But if you're interested in looking at some Scottish mountain hare pictures, there's a website called karenmillenphotography.co.uk, and she has the most amazing photographs of mountain hares, and she's got gorgeous photographs of them grooming. So I'd recommend people having a look at that if you're anyway interested. So they spend a long time grooming, because it's really important to keep in good condition. Yeah. Sorry, it doesn't want to move down for me. Let me see if I can get it to go. Whoop. Okay. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, tracks and signs. So quite often, hares are quite secretive creatures. They don't necessarily like you to see them. Though sometimes in the spring they can be quite oblivious to the fact that someone's there watching them, particularly if they're chasing around each other around. So looking for tracks and signs is another good way of knowing that you have hares in your area. Snow and frost can be really handy because you can find the tracks. So you'll see a long footprint, as you can see on this photo, and then a little short footprint. So the long one is obviously the hind leg and the short one is the front leg. And sometimes you'll see these prints in mud as well. So that's one way to know them. And then the other thing to look out for are pellets or hair pellets or droppings. So hair pellets droppings are very distinctive. If any of you smoke or know people that smoke, particularly if any of you remember people smoking the packet tobacco many years ago, it almost looks like that. So you get these very fine fibrous bits in the pellets, and they have a very distinctive shape. And quite often they're deposited just in small little groups, and you'll see them on vegetation. They're particularly easy to find on those heathery peatland upland areas. Another thing in terms of behavior as well is that hares seem to like airports. So I don't know if any of you have flown out of Belfast Airport or Dublin Airport, and you might have noticed as you're taking off hares in the along the side in the grass. And a number of studies have been done on the most recent one has been by a student from University College Cork, and he was looking at hares in Dublin Airport. And the reason they think hares like airports is because generally airports are fenced, so therefore pressure from predators is probably a lot less. So foxes particularly aren't getting into those areas. There's plenty of grass for them to eat along the edges, but at the same time, they can they can be killed by airplanes as well. But some of you may have noticed, and certainly the last time, which is a long time ago, the last time I flew out of Dublin Airport, I did see them there, and I even saw them in the car park as well. So do have a look if you're frequenting any airport. So if you look at the National Biodiversity Data Centre, which holds records for all sorts of animals and plants around Ireland, the distribution map for the Irish hare looks really good. They're found throughout the whole of the country. So that's, looks really positive. But if we look back at historical records, and usually these historical records come from estates, so large estates would have kept game bag records, and these game bags, so they would have kept a record of how many hares were shot or netted on the estate. So the wealthy landlords would have gone out, held a shooting party, and they would have recorded how many guns they had and how many hares were shot on a given day. And we can look back at some of these records. Now, these are for the ones, the graph here shows the whole of Ireland. So I think it's 14 estates across both North and South Ireland. And if we look at those game bag records, we can see that on certain days on certain estates, people were going out and maybe shooting 100, 200 hares in one afternoon. So we think, and certainly when we look at records from Britain as well, that there used to be a lot more hares in the countryside in general. And it looks like hare populations, not just Irish hare populations, but populations in Britain and across Europe have declined considerably and were much larger in the mid 19th to early 20th century than they are today. And it's these game back records that suggest that. Back in 2007, there was a national hare survey was carried out throughout the whole of the Republic of Ireland. And the method they used was going out to selected 1 kilometre square grids and doing a spotlight night count at 5 points along a 1 kilometre transect. And from that survey, there was, a really good distribution of hares was found throughout the whole of the country. And back then in the latest survey was carried out 10 years later, between 2017 and 2019, and a slightly different method was used. Well, a much different method was used. They used camera traps so the camera traps were left at randomly chosen spots. Again, I think it was 5 within a 1 kilometre square, and they recorded for 24/7 for 5 days. So 596 cameras were set out throughout the whole of Ireland, and using lots of statistics, they were able to compare what was found in certain habitats, work out how much of that habitat covered the whole of Ireland, and then estimate what the population of the Irish hare was. So it's estimated that there's roughly 200,000 individual hares from that survey. But with every estimate, there are things called confidence limits. So it could be anything as low as 100,000, and it may be as high as 450,000. And it works out as roughly 3 hares for every square kilometre, with the highest densities being found in the northwest and the southwest, and the lowest densities being found in the east of the country. So we think roughly, 3 hares per hectare is what we currently support here in Ireland. And there's many threats to hares. They are legally protected under the Wildlife Act. They're also listed in the Berne Convention as an internationally important species. However, even though they are listed and they are legally protected, they are still classed as a game or quarry species. So they can be hunted under license. And they can also be captured for use in coursing as well. And another issue is there are the coursing events which are licensed, but then there's also people that will go out with lurchers for sort of unlicensed coursing events. And there's anecdotal evidence that where people do go out with lurchers is that the populations of hares decline in those areas. But there's only anecdotal evidence to support that at the moment. Our rodent, unfortunately, probably most of the hares that I see are unfortunately squashed on the roads. So hares, crossing busy roads, often crossing at night when they're most active. Also, so many of them unfortunately fall victim to cars and lorries and what have you as well. And then there's the changes in farming practices. So if we look at those game bag records, the hares used to be we think hare numbers used to be much higher. But over the years, farming practices have changed. So there's increased use of machinery, there's higher livestock densities, there's a decrease in the variety of grasses that are grown. And all these factors may have combined to the decline in hare numbers. And then there's the loss of resting places, particularly areas with rushes or good quality hedgerows. There's mowing of silage as opposed to the cutting of hay, where particularly back in the 50s and 60s, where hay would have been cut by the hand, and the hares would have had time to escape. So mortality, particularly in young hares, is probably quite high due to silage cutting. So hares are, they're wonderful creatures. They're amazing to watch. And if you look at our culture, the Celts believed that hares were sacred and mystical animals. It was often seen as a symbol of abundance and prosperity and good fortune. To the extent that hares were actually very rarely eaten by the Celts, and they were often eaten only during festivals. And hares were also believed to have connections to the other world. So again, that mystic sort of idea about around them, and it may have something to do with the fact that hares were believed to have supernatural qualities or powers. They could shape shift. There is a legend about the Celtic warrior Uiscin, who had hunted a hare and had wounded it on its leg, and he'd followed the wounded animal and he'd found a door, and when he entered that door he came into a large hall and he found this beautiful woman who was sitting and her leg was bleeding. So these whole this number of stories like this attached to the hare. And because they were active at night, mostly, they're often associated with the moon, and the April full moon in olden days was known as the hare moon. And it's not just in the Irish culture. There are many cultures that the hare is seen as a symbol of fertility, magic, and regeneration as well. Potentially because it's maybe was seen more often in the spring, and that the pagans believed that the hare moon was a promise of growth and new beginnings. And the hare was also attached to a goddess that was connected to fertility. So, and that might have linked to the hare's own reproductive rates, which maybe aren't as great as a rabbit, but still, those are the thoughts. So hares are important not just in Irish culture, but also worldwide as well. And I forgot to mention, some of you may remember, the coin that used to have the hare on it as well. Though if you look at the length of the ears on that hare, they're a bit long for an Irish hare. It almost looks like brown hare ears. So just to remember that the Irish hare has got quite short ears. And then some of you, if you're in Clare, you certainly have heard of Hare's Corner, which is an old farming expression where a corner of the field would have been left in an area of rough ground, and it wouldn't have been cultivated, and it was left for nature, so it was called the Hare's Corner. And the Birnbeo Trust have a lovely initiative called the Hare's Corner, which allows landowners to make a little space for nature by creating maybe a mini wood or a mini orchard or a pond. So it's a great and it's a lovely way of continuing that whole idea of the Hare's Corner and leaving that little piece of land for nature. So that's basically I'm sure that there might be a few questions.
That's thank you ever so much, Karina. That was an absolutely fabulous talk, and well done. Your internet managed to hold out in there as well. So I'm seriously impressed. And I have to say as well, thank you for the plug for the Hares Corner too. So
No,
your
it's brilliant.
research.
It's a lovely initiative. So I had to put it in there as well.
Oh, absolutely, and hopefully it will end up with lots more land being put aside for the hares. So no, that was incredibly interesting. Thank you ever so much. And beautiful pictures of the hare. I mean, it is such a stunning creature. So if anyone has any questions, they want to put them into the question and answer. That's usually the easiest way for us to see them, or you can put any comments or anything into the chat as well. So we do actually have one question here now, Karina, from Niall, who says, how can I attract hares into my farm?
Um, Good question. I mean, I'd love to have more of them around me as well. I mean, the main thing is, is think about having little refuge areas. So having those traditional hare corners in your field. So I'm not sure what kind of farming Niall does, if he has cattle but if he has, say, a hay field or a silage field, is there a little corner he can leave for hares? Any having good hedgerows as well, providing lots of protection, a diversity of habitats, diversity of grasses, all those things are important for hares.
Lovely, that's brilliant. Thanks, Karina. And that just reminded me as well of your hares coming up to the mountains in the winter time and down in the summertime is a bit like the Burren Winterage idea.
It is, yeah.
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 Made me think your hares are just like our cattle. So a really nice connection there. We've also got one person has asked, are hares susceptible to disease like rabbits with myxomatosis? I'm impressed that he can spell myxomatosis. I'm assuming that's how you spell it, because I wouldn't have the faintest clue. So can they get diseases like that?
Yeah, so unfortunately there are a number of diseases. There's one like myxomatosis called it's a hemorrhagic disease, and there was a bit of a panic. I think it was just pre-COVID where a couple of hares were found with it, and it is a disease that occurs in brown hares in Britain, and where it gets into a population, it can spread from one animal to another. And there was a couple of hares, dead hares picked up around Wexford a few years ago that did have that. But thankfully, that seemed to all die down. So yes, there are, and that's why it needs to be very careful, people, because in years gone by, coursing clubs and others would have brought hares from out, from different countries, and they'd have brought them into Ireland. And when you move animals about, there's a big risk of moving those diseases. And our hares wouldn't have a natural immunity for those diseases. So, but thankfully, touch wood, that those couple of incidents that did happen, and I think it was just pre-COVID, nothing seemed to come of it. So hopefully but there are diseases out there, so it's just something to be aware of and to watch for.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Karina. There's a couple of people. Thank you for such an informative talk about our gorgeous native animals, and thank you for an interesting talk. There's one here now from Brendan, well, more than one, but I'll start with some of them. So what's the average lifespan of a hare?
Okay, so in the wild, 2, 3, 4 years maximum. And mortality is highest obviously in the younger hares. So it generally, a lot of them will die in their first year, from all sorts of things, predation, getting run over by cars, whatever it is. But so yeah, quite short-lived.
Okay, lovely. And that was from Brendan saying terrific presentation as well. And I think kind of his main other questions have been answered. What are the main predators of the hare? He's assuming it's probably the fox.
Yeah, foxes, anything that can catch them will will take them. So leverets obviously are more maybe from things like that. Stoats might even take them, pine martens if they can get them. But hares are fast. But if they're injured, old, then more likely to fall victim to predators. Dogs can disturb them as well. So again, if you're out and about in upland habitats particularly, keep your dogs on a lead, because they might come across a leveret, and obviously leveret isn't going to have the speed of an adult hare.
Brilliant. That's very good advice. Thank you. There's a few more comments here. So someone watching from America says they have the snowshoe hares in Maine. They turn from brown to white in winter and are wonderful. And again, someone just said they've had the pleasure of observing 2 hares boxing many years ago outside Kenmare and felt so privileged to have seen them. So, there's a really lovely, strong connection between people and their hares. We have here as well, great presentation, thanks. Are there other reference sources for further study on hares? I was actually looking up the book you mentioned about the Dublin Harekeeper, and I actually couldn't find it. So.
Oh, good. I'll find it and I'll email it to you, so you can share with people.
Fabulous.
There's a couple of I think the leap, I called it the leap of the hare, but that might be actually about the brown hare. But it's a lovely book to read because it's about anything else. The surveys I mentioned are both available online through the National Parks and Wildlife Service website. If you just put in hare survey NPWS, you'll find the 2 surveys online, and they're quite scientific, but the executive summaries are easy to read and just give some general information about the hares. There is I'm just trying to see, there's a lovely visual sort of photo book. It's just called Hares, and it's just lovely to look at. But I definitely recommend the Karen Miller website as well, if you just want to have a look at some gorgeous wildlife photographs, and her hare pictures are just stunning.
That is brilliant. Thank you, Karina. I have a few new books now for my Christmas shopping list. So that's just wonderful. Thank you. And there's loads of other comments. Thanks for the talk. Really interesting. And we've another question down here now. Are hares territorial?
Yes, so I'm not sure territorial is the right word. They'll have a home range, and they will tend to stick within that, but other hares will come and go within that. So I suppose during the breeding season, the female hares might be a little bit more aggressive towards hares being about. But if you look at them, in those big enclosed areas like the airports, they're quite happy there to be in quite high densities. So again, it's, if there's enough food available, if there's enough shelter available, then, they're fine. So I hope that answers the question.
No, and that's really interesting, especially when you're talking about the hares boxing as well. I suppose sometimes that's seen as territorial behavior, trying to chase them out of their territory. So no, that's really interesting to hear. We've got another question as well. Do farmers, I'm not sure if you're going to know this now, but do they check their fields for any signs of hares before cutting the silage, or is this something that could be worth looking into maybe?
Yeah, so the actions that farmers take for corn cricks, where they go into the middle of the field and mow out, helps hares as well. So if you mow from the center of the field to the outside, so any actions like that are going to be beneficial for hares. But again, it's way back in the late 90s when I was doing the survey work, and I spoke to a lot of farmers. They had a real grow for hares. There was a general, like here with your comments, people just love them. I suppose they're such an iconic animal. They're not seen that often, and yet people know they're there. So people do really, farmers do like them, and they love to see them around. So I think if they knew they were in their fields, that they would do their best to make sure that they weren't in a silage field.
Oh, for definite, I'm sure they would do. And that's interesting about the corncrake, that mowing for the corncrake actually helps the hair too. So it's a good
Yeah,
thing to remember.
yeah, yeah.
A definite. Now we've got another question here about the hares going uphill in the winter, coming down to lower ground in the summer. So a bit like the Burren winter grazing cows. And why is that, do you think? Why are they coming down in the summertime?
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I mean, there's no evidence for this. It's literally anecdotal evidence that I have from speaking to farmers, and it'll only be in areas, where you have those upland peaty areas, and then the green fields below. So quite often the green fields are reclaimed fields, and you speak to a farmer, and you'd be saying, "Oh," quite often, for doing any general survey work, I'll ask a farmer, are there any hares around? And he'd be going, oh, sure, you won't see them now. Sure, they'll be up in the hills. They won't be down now till next month. It's too early yet. So, that would be the general comment about them. And I suspect that it is probably true. They'll go up to the uplands for the winter. There's plenty of cover in amongst the sedges and the heathers, while the lower fields that are probably reclaimed bog a lot of the time, they're open fields. They've just got ryegrass on them. They might have sheep on them over those winter months. But then in the spring, when you get that flush of growth, it might be just that nice green grass is just a little bit too attractive for them, and they think they'll come down and they'll feed up on that and get that extra energy that they might need for reproducing. That's just purely my theory. There's no scientific proof at all behind that, but that's
It
what I
sounds good
think.
to me. Definitely sounds good to me. And I think that's so lovely as well, that the farmers can see where the hare are and they kind of remember what time of year they're coming back down on. So I think that
Yeah,
connection between the farmers and the hare on their land, that's just really beautiful.
yeah.
Um,
I think as well that, sometimes as the summer progresses as well, the vegetation is getting taller. So even though they're there, we're not seeing them.
mm,
So I think that's why people tend to see them more March, April, May time, because the vegetation is lower. You can see them walking through the field or whatever it is. So that's another thing just to be aware of as well, that once the grass starts growing, they quickly disappear into it, and they're small enough.
that's a very good point as well, isn't it? We kind of, we forget that they're still out there for the rest of the year. And there's just one more question here now. If anyone else has any questions, if you get them in quickly, just before we finish, with a couple of minutes left. So again, we've got Niall, who is asking about attracting hares. Niall says, I only see one hare. Does that mean they're alone, or are they visiting a mate, or are they just coming and going, or could that be the female with the baby, just the one by itself?
Yeah, so quite often when we see them, they are generally solitary creatures, so they tend to be alone, and really, it's only when they're breeding that they tend to come together in groups, and even those groups tend to be small, two, three, maybe four individuals. You're lucky if you see more. And while he's only seeing one at any one time, it may not be the same individual. So there's probably a few more hares around. Um, and they can be quite hard to distinguish. The easiest time to distinguish them is in the winter months when they get their winter coat, because some of them tend to be whiter than others. So if he keeps a good eye on it if he's seeing it in the winter, and look at its ears and feet particularly, and then you can start distinguishing individuals apart. They might have, big white socks or big white ears. So it's just little things to look out for.
Brilliant. That's great. So we're all going to have to keep an eye and see if we can find different things to identify them all by. And we've got one last question here now from Brendan that says, were hares used as a food source in the past? Rabbits certainly were, so I wonder.
Yeah, so certainly they were used. I mean, jugged hare is like a famous recipe. And when they were shooting them on the estates, they were being brought into the kitchens and they were being eaten. But the Celts seemingly didn't like to eat them, because of this mystical quality that they had. So yes, they definitely have been eaten. I think people that they're quite I've been told they're quite a strong flavor, is a real flavor of game. So I think if people might have preferred eating rabbit because it wasn't such a strong meat. But absolutely, they were definitely eaten
Brilliant.
over the years. Yeah.
I must say that the thought of a jugged hare, it doesn't sound very attractive, really, does it? It doesn't sound very tempting. There was one other. Have you ever seen the connection? I think in Marion Dowd, when she was excavating in a cave in the Burren, she found a few leverets on top of the deposits left in the cave. And have you heard
There's
about
definitely there's definitely evidence, fossil evidence from caves. So that is one of the indications that we know that they were here, you know, after the Ice Age. So it is based on the fossil evidence from caves.
And I think she was finding that they were left as a deposit, so in archaeological kind of time periods. So
okay, so that they might
that
they were being eaten, you think, as
or
well.
ritually deposited when
Okay.
So
well, again, that might go back to the whole idea of the mystical element and the otherworldly element that they're associated with as well.
Definitely, really interesting. Well, I think that's it. That's the end of the questions now. Lots of people in the chat have been saying thank you ever so much. And Karina, that was just absolutely amazing. I feel like I know a whole lot more about the hares now, so I'm going to be looking a little bit more closer when I see them out and around in the Burren and things, especially in the winter time, to see if we can work out if we have different ones.
Yeah, everyone... I know they're wonderful creatures to watch. Definitely recommend.
Aren't they? Absolutely. So thank you so much. That was so interesting. And for everyone else watching, if you've found the presentation on the hares tonight, you'll probably know where the Burren in Bloom programme is, but it can be found at burreninbloom.com on the website. So we have more events going on throughout the month of May. But I must say, Karina, at the moment, I think that's my absolute favourite one tonight. So don't tell the others.
So much. Thanks so much. And thank you everyone for listening and for all the questions as well.
Lovely, and thank you so much for joining us. It's just been an absolutely fabulous evening. So maybe we'll get to meet you in person one day doing a survey in the Burren. You'll have to come and call in.
Yeah, definitely Burren's on my list to return visit, definitely very, very soon.
Oh, we'll owe you a cup of coffee and a biscuit. It's been such a lovely evening. So good night to everyone, and thank you ever so much.